Hi, so my name is Lana Woolf and I am an independent consultant, a social inclusion specialist in the humanitarian and international development context. And I work with people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, expressions and sex characteristics, people with various disabilities, and women who have very low socioeconomic status. So today I'm going to be talking about different ways I've used story as a participatory research and community development method. Firstly, I'll be using examples from my own work that I've undertaken, both within Australia. I'll be using some examples from Fiji and from Southeast Asia, and I'll be using a variety of examples. So we dream in narrative, we daydream in narrative, we remember, anticipate, hope, despair, believe, doubt, plan, revise, criticize, construct, gossip, learn, hate, and love by narrative. We live in a world shaped by stories. Stories are the threads of our lives and the fabric of human cultures. A story can unite or divide people, obscure issues, or spotlight new perspectives. A story can inform or deceive, enlighten or entertain, or do all of the above. As humans, we're literally hardwired for stories. Harvard University evolutionary psychologist Steven Pinker argues that stories are essential to human learning and building relationships in social groups. There's growing consensus in the scientific community that neurological roots of both storytelling and enjoyment of stories are tied to our social cognition. One widely cited 1944 experiment, psychologists Fritz Heider and Mary Ann Simmel showed a bunch of subjects an animation of a pair of triangles and circle moving around a square, and asked what was happening. The subjects' responses were something around the circle is chasing the triangles. And it revealed how they mapped a narrative onto the shapes. Numerous subsequent studies have reiterated how humans, as social creatures, see stories everywhere. Now, each one of us would have told hundreds of stories, whether how your day was, getting for your coffee, how you got to work. We tell stories all the time. They're an essential part of the way that we connect and communicate and understand our lives and our world around us. So just as we tell ourselves stories about the world we live in, stories also tell how we live. A myth is simply a traditional story accepted as history that serves to explain the worldview of people. Myths may be mistakenly dismissed as folktales from long ago, but even today, a sea of stories tell us who we are, what we do, and what we believe. People use stories to process the information we encounter from families and upbringing, educational institutions, religious and cultural institutions, the media, our peers, and community. We remember our lived experiences by converting them into narratives and integrating them into our personal and collective web of stories. So firstly, I'm going to talk about using Talanoa as a research methodology. Talanoa is a Pacific Island activity that is more than a dialogue. It's a form of communication, a part of tradition and ritual, and has several important components that make it a wonderful tool for community development and research. In Tonga, the word is taken from the terms tala, meaning to tell stories or talk, and noa, meaning what comes from the heart. The term Talanoa has similar meanings in Samoa, where it's referred to as a conversation between people. And Fiji, the word Talanoa, although not found in the dictionary, many Fijians will say that it has the same meaning. It's important to note that when I've used Talanoa, it has not been strictly in a traditional sense. As a young person, I witnessed Talanoa sessions by cisgender male family members and was taught that Talanoa was traditional men's business. As a teenager, being a bit naughty, hanging around with other young family friends, we sat in circles and drank kava that we stole from our family members, and we connected and we communicated. But in these instances, where either I witnessed Talanoa or I participated in Talanoa, I really started to understand that it was about becoming connected, building and maintaining connections, and building and maintaining communication. We also set the parameters for our own discussion, and it really helped create a sense of community between us. The first time I used Talanoa as a community activity was in Southeast Queensland. It was in the early 2000s, and I was a social inclusion focused focal point at the Queensland peak body of community mental health, at the time called Queensland Alliance. A small NGO who was a member organisation contacted us because they'd successfully bid for funds to work with the Pacific Islander community. Due to his words, Pacific Islanders have a lot of stigma around mental illness. Being the social inclusion focal point and the only Pacifica person in the organisation, I was asked to mediate and find a solution. I went to the community and spoke to community leaders. In this case, it was the religious leaders of the community. They were really disparaging of their NGO and the person leading the project. I negotiated to take over the project, but I didn't talk about mental health or stigma. I talked about joining together as a Pacifica community and sharing stories, and about facilitating a particular topic each month. Topics that were related to mental well-being, but without talking about mental illness. So topics like the importance of family or the importance of community. So I worked with the local community to design a small project, and we spent the money hiring the hall once a month. The local Pacifica community took turns working groups to make a large dinner for the community based on our traditional foods. And I facilitated Talanoa sessions about those specific themes. For example, one month might be connecting with family back on islands. It was in this process that I witnessed the formalization of using Talanoa in broader communities. And for the first time, outside of being a naughty teenager with my peers, seeing Talanoa sessions with women actively involved. Now, something to understand about, and this is generalized across the Pacific, is that when Pacific Islander folks meet each other and don't really know each other or only partially know of each other, there are several things that we tend to do. We share who we are. Our family tree is such, what villages or island communities we come from. Essentially, we explain what we call our vanua, our family history, our geographical locations, and our spiritual affiliations. And this is just something that happens in Pacifica communities without much conscious thought because it's the way we're brought up. But in the Talanoa process, this is formalized. It allows us to understand how we're connected and also how we're disconnected, what family or tribal feuds that exist, what disagreements and conflicts we have to work through. Because of the way that Pacific Islander people are community focused, when the Pacifica folks were telling stories of, for example, their families back in the islands, they didn't just tell a story as an individual. As we moved through the circle, each person shared their story, but connected it to the stories beforehand, sharing why it was the same as the others or why it was different, but created community stories of shared experiences. Upon reflection, I realized that this is a formal research methodology, that Talanoa achieved several important research functions. It involved the construction of hypotheses and theories. And through the use of Talanoa, together we were collecting, and together we were making sense of people's experiences. So Talanoa as a research methodology was a data collection and analysis occurring simultaneously by the community. It initiated social processes which were shared and elaborated on. It created space for ideas and concepts of what was happening, and those were discussed. And it was a place of sharing differences in experiences, but also how to resolve those differences and making sense of how those things were different. And lastly, recommendations were always collaboratively agreed on. So it was a whole process of telling their story, connecting it to a community story, making sense of their own individual stories and their community stories, and then creating, I guess, or foreshadowing future stories that they wanted to create. They were collectively making recommendations about what they wanted to change. So in essence, the traditional method of Talanoa fit neatly into the concept of grounded theory, a very formalized research methodology. So to move on, in 2018, when I was designing the research methodology for the project Down by the River, which was funded by DFAT through Oxfam, and I worked as EdgeEffect with Rainbow Pride Foundation to understand the experiences of people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities and expressions and sex characteristics, and their response and the humanitarian response in Cyclone Winston. So do people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, expressions and sex characteristics in Fiji access humanitarian response and aid? So I used Talanoa and facilitated Talanoa sessions as a research method and brought together people with diverse SOGS to share their individual and collective experiences accessing humanitarian response. They were able to identify in their stories why they had different experiences based on location, really practical things like the damage to their home, the access to cash, their acceptance from families, and the different barriers they faced. And so through this process, in a really participatory way, they shared the information, they analysed the information, they discussed what was different and made sense of their shared experiences and humanitarian response. So I'll move on to using story harvesting as a research and community engagement method. In the same year, in 2018, I was engaged by a consultant by Moreland City Council in Victoria, Australia, to undertake a story harvesting process about homelessness. And this project was called A Home in Moreland. In this example, I created groups based at tables that were engaged in specific conversations about homelessness in Moreland. And there was lots of different people involved, from people who were homeless to local community members that owned houses and were worried about the homeless situation, to social workers, to local government workers. We had a whole gamut of people. And we decided to use this story harvesting process because it was a really ideal way to find out what the community was thinking and feeling about homelessness. So we created these tables where really specific conversations were happening. Like table one was how can we respond to the issues of experiencing homelessness? How can we effectively respond to people experiencing homelessness? How can we make a positive impact on homelessness? So it was a real space of asking a whole bunch of really specific questions about how. Table 2 was about connection. How do we interact with people experiencing homelessness? What interactions are helpful, etc. Table 3 was really focused on communication. How do we communicate the reality of homelessness? What myths exist about homelessness and so forth? And table 4 was why. So each time one person would stay at a particular table and everyone else would move. And so with each new table, a new theme for conversation, and questions we're able to build on and focus on, engaged in the community conversations, they then came together to unpack the conversations and make sense of the homelessness issue in the local area from the many different experiences and positions they held. They were able then, as a larger group, to make recommendations that they all agreed on based on those stories. So to sum up, collective story harvesting is a storytelling process that enables us to deeply connect with and learn from the experiences of the communities we work with. It builds capacity for targeted listening, group learning, and for collective meaning making. And it takes learning to a deeper level as it surfaces insights that exist beneath the surface of people's and community stories. And this is really important because we get to unpack not just the myths or the meta-narratives that we have, but people's particular experiences. And I really like this quote. When discussing culture, media theorist Marshall McLuhan reminds his students, we don't know who discovered water, but we can assume it wasn't a fish. So again, it really speaks to that space of it being participatory and community-centered and about their lived experience being really integral to the process. I'm currently in Indonesia, about to embark on a new social protection research project using narrative inquiry. And narrative inquiry is really being able to go deeper into a story and people's experiences. Often when we're talking about quantitative research, many researchers have very structured questions, and it doesn't allow space for people to be able to say why or how or what context, what local experiences they're having. And so with narrative inquiry, we think about using story and surfacing people's stories, not just what happened, but the context behind it, why it happened, how it happened. And so thinking about narrative inquiry and developing training and implementing the training with the local partners and the local research assistants that are working with me, we're using this idea of events, experiences, emotions, and perspective. So events, what happened? Experiences, it happened to me. Emotions, I felt something about. And perspective, I understood it this way. And so it's about asking stories with a story ending. Tell me a story about accessing, for example, the health insurance to be able to go to the doctors. Or tell me about how you were able to go to the doctors. Tell me what happened. Tell me what was the process of getting there? You know, perhaps saying, well, I don't have social health insurance. I don't have an ID card. And so I couldn't go to this doctor. So I had to go to that doctor over the other side of town. I had to wait 3 days because I had to find the money to be able to go. This is how I felt about it. And this is how I understand my experience. So again, it's a participatory process where not only are they sharing their experiences, but their perspectives of their experiences. They make sense of that. It's not an outsider in this case, me saying, well, this is what their story means. This is how I define it. They get to define the perspective themselves and create the context. And in this case, I simply call myself a story catcher. The last example that I'm going to give is action-orientated storytelling. And this is based on a project, a 5-year water sanitation and hygiene project in Indonesia. It's a participatory action research project. So I went to the local, I had 6 different groups, but I'm going to be speaking particularly about one group that happens to be Waria and Transpuan. In this case, similar to trans women. Now, in this project, being participatory action research, they got to define what they wanted to work on in terms of wash or water sanitation and hygiene. They got to decide what the issues were most pressing for them and what the priorities of the project should be. In this case, it was being able to access the local toilet in the market. And part of this was because they didn't have access to toilets, houses. And so being able to access a local toilet was integral because for some of them, it's the only toilet they can access. And they decided that this was pressing because of the discrimination and stigma and bullying they experienced. They would often not go to the toilet or, feel compelled to participate in open defecation, a wash term of using, I guess, no toilets, and which is a health issue for the whole community. And it's also a health issue for them with high rates of urinary tract infections and all sorts of things. Going through this process, they decided that they wanted to use storytelling. And I am a big fan of storytelling, but only certain types of storytelling. I was very critical and continue to be very critical of telling a story of stigma and discrimination and trauma, and that being it. And the reason why I'm so challenged by that is because I see the same thing happening again and again and again. Firstly, the person telling their story of trauma and discrimination just continues to re-traumatize themselves and be stuck in a story of traumatization. And the people listening to it who come along because, they genuinely care, listen to a story of trauma and think, oh, that was so inspiring. And then they go home and nothing ever changes. And so in this case, I was like, well, absolutely. But if we want to create change from our stories, they have to be action-orientated. And so what does being action-orientated mean? It means in this case, and I've done this quite a few times, is facilitating a story development strategy where they tell the story of me, their story, and there may be a little bit of trauma involved, but that is based on, and it doesn't have to be trauma, but it's based on what inspires them to be change makers in the community, what inspires them to want something different. The story of us is the story of the community, and I guess that collective story around what their experiences are, and the story of change, what they want to have to be different, but also what action people need to take. And so it is really a strategy-based story method in which there's really this focus on not only what they want to change, but how that change happens, what the listeners have to go away and specifically do. And in this case, it was a variety of things: share the video, advocate for change, very specific what they wanted different and changed about the toilet in the market. and who needed to do that change. And it was really successful. It was successful because the community were able to formalize their community as a registered organization. They were able to get funding, and they were able to be integrated into the local WASH mechanism and be supported to participate in the WASH changes that the local government needed to make to ensure that they're inclusive, not just of the warrior community, but also women and people with disabilities. So those are kind of the strategies that I've been going through, and some of the strategies that I've been using in terms of story-based strategy as a research methodology and as a community development methodology. So I wonder now if anybody has any questions for me about these methods. Please feel free to unmute your microphones and ask the question. Ilan.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. My question is, what the role of fiction? Because I think when you spoke about story, it was a lot about the stories of people, lived experiences. But when I think about stories, I also think about fictional stories, and I'm wondering if this can also play a role. Thanks.
Sure. So I guess as a humanitarian international development social inclusion practitioner, it is people's experiences, being able to create a space so people's experiences are central to the changes that they think are necessary in the aid sector, or share the by story, because I think fiction is really tricky, because if I share just super quickly another example, and again, it's another Fiji one, where from down by the river, one of the things that we realized was the rise of what's called religious disaster narratives, LGBT people being blamed for disasters. And the way that that was understood was by particularly people in different villages, that their understanding of the world is through the lens of Christianity. That a couple of millennia ago, God came to Noah and said, there's too much sin. He flooded the earth to get rid of all of the sinners. And then at the end, he promised that he would never flood the earth again. And he showed the rainbow as a promise that he would never do it. And so these community members were like, well, the earth is flooding. Our understanding is the earth is flooding. Our islands are going under. Our villages are being moved. The oceans are rising. This is our understanding of the flooding. And LGBT people have taken that rainbow and they use it and they flaunt their sins. And so having to work with them and bringing together LGBT people, people of faith and community leaders to use what I call a narrative power analysis to unpack these stories and create new stories of climate change. So I guess what I'm saying is there's a line between fiction and non-fiction, but in terms of purely fiction, I don't.
Thank you.
Herbert, do you have a question? You can unmute your microphone.
Can I go on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Lana. So I'm thinking about this in as my role as a project manager. I'm new in my role, and I'm I'm in the process of hunting for new strategies and tools, especially to to make my report to be more colorful, in terms of what do you call that, like evidence of change. So this is um, um, I assume this can be used in collecting all the data, all information of evidence of changes. Yeah.
Yes, it can be. And in fact, through storytelling, you get a lot of data. For the social protection piece that I'm doing at the moment, we're doing community mapping. So telling stories about how people move through particular locations, and why they're accessing particular or not accessing particular social protection mechanisms. And then from that, we're going deeper into one-on-one story-based interviews. And through that process is extraordinarily large amounts of data just in that process alone, as one example.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All right.
So
Thank you.
It marries very well with other community and participatory based methodologies, for example, like community mapping. Ashra.
Hi, Lana. Thanks. This was really interesting. I just have a question around story harvesting and narrative inquiry, I guess. Is there any sort of resources that I can look into? Because I'd be interested to try it out with groups we work with.
Yeah.
Yeah, just wondering if there's anything that you could share with us. Thank you.
I'm trying to think. I'm not sure. I'm sure that there are. I'm not sure about any that aren't kind of academic resources that you unpack and develop. Or there might be with story harvesting. And I'm sure if you look, there's opportunity to find story harvesting things just on the internet. I'm just gonna put in the chat box the story harvesting report, and that will unpack a little bit story harvesting for you. In terms of narrative inquiry, that's more of an academic space. I'm sure that if you looked up in academic journals, you would find some stuff. Sorry if that wasn't very particularly helpful.
No, that was good. That was good. Like, yeah, just a bit of a guidance on like where to go if I needed it.
I have a little bit of stuff on my website, Community Powered Responses, but that's more like just a little bit of background into the narrative power piece and things like that. Not so much unpacking. But have a look on the website. There are some, yeah. Any other questions? Okay. If not, I want to thank you for your time and energy. There's another webinar. I'm going to be hosting webinars once a month. The next one is on participatory action research. And Ashra, I do have a whole water sanitation and hygiene toolkit for participatory action research. So there is a great deal there. Saska, you have a question?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know how to press to raise hand. Okay, now I know. So my question about more on the action-oriented oriented storytelling. I know that our focus is about the facilitating the storytelling from the audience from the group that we are working with. But I wonder about when we use this particular method of action-oriented, then it means we are working with another level of planning, maybe not only digging information and stories from the communities, but also something that we need to keep in mind that okay, after the story from what happened with them, now we need to get rid because we need to make action out of it. So it's like a different step of community engagement, I would say. So is that really so, if I understand correctly, that method?
Absolutely. In this particular process, it was a part of a really long 5-year process. And so, you know, things that happened beforehand, for example, was a theory of change was developed. I did this through using a problem tree and a solution tree. They identified their problems and then they identified the solutions. Part of that solution was changing the stigma and discrimination. The method that they wanted to do that was storytelling. Then we did things like stakeholder mapping and spectrum of ally tools to be able to identify who can make the change in the community, who's the most affected, who's the target audience around making that change. How can we bring people along with us to build enough people power to make that change through the spectrum of allies tool? Who's passively supportive, who's actively supportive, who's neutral, so that we can bring more people to the cause of supporting warrior rights, who's actively against and who's passively against, and how can we create enough people power that they don't have enough power to, I guess, change or to stop the warrior community being able to advocate. So you're right, a whole bunch of work was done before actually the stories and a whole bunch of planning work. It was very participatory, so the community decided what their problems were, what the solutions were, how they wanted to address the solutions. They identified who their allies were and their target audience was. All I did was facilitate through, I guess, really simple activities and tools, them to be able to surface their pre-existing knowledge about that. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, very much. I understand, and thank you for explaining it. Thank you, Lana.
Okay. So any last questions or comments? Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I hope that I will see you again. As I said, I'm hosting free webinars each month. The next one is on participatory action research as a methodology to use in the aid sector. So thank you and have a good week. Bye.